Greetings from the Heartland, Omaha, Nebraska, with another edition of TomBecka.com, where everybody has a great story to tell. And this podcast page, if you're new to it, what we do is every week we introduce you to another person in the community with something to add, an interesting story, perhaps a lifestyle, perhaps an experience, or just something they're trying to accomplish to show the total human picture. Because I've been fortunate in my life. I've been able to travel a lot. I've been able to go to a bunch of places all over the world, all over the country, and meet a lot of different people. And one thing I found out is that we're a lot more alike than we want to admit. But sometimes with the media and the news stories and that, you only hear the bad stuff. You only hear, things that maybe you wouldn't care for too much, and because you never get a chance to go to some of these places. Well, Julia is an unabashed liberal. She is also a person of strong faith. And she wants to go out and try to make the world a better place. And as such, she has gone out into the world. And, if all you saw about Syria, and if all you knew about Lebanon is what you saw in the news, you really wouldn't get a full picture. Just like if all you saw, if all you knew about the town where you live is what you saw in the news, you wouldn't get a full picture there either. So when I had the chance to talk to Julie about what it's like in Lebanon, what it's like in Syria, well, I just couldn't let that chance pass me by.
I've been to Syria twice, been to Lebanon 3 times, been to Iraq 3 times. And those all came about through very interesting circumstances, I thought. Never thought I was going to be traveling to the Middle East. But it's one of those things that was a touch point to me from the time I was fairly young. When my dad remarried when I was in high school, I gained a stepbrother who was a journalist. Out of college, he got a job for NBC as a cameraman, and that was in the late 70s, early 80s, and Charlie spent a lot of his early time with NBC covering the Civil War in Lebanon. So every night, we'd group around the television like the good old days a family did, and we would watch the nightly news, waiting for the credits to see L. Charles Zachariah as cameraman photographer on some of those stories. And, it was a pretty exciting thing to know you had a stepbrother in the Middle East covering the news. At the same time, growing up in the midst of the Vietnam War, I said, this is kind of my church life. I prayed every night that the war would end because I didn't want my older brother George being drafted. So I had this sort of connection with being an anti-war activist. At the same time, the excitement of my stepbrother being over there covering that. Years later, many, many, many years later, actually in church, in a women's Bible study we were having, one of our participants, not a member of our church, but she'd been invited, was a woman who was from Lebanon. She and her husband are both doctors here in Omaha now, and her name was Maya. In 2006, she decided to go back and visit her folks who still lived there and take her kids with her. And I think an aunt, someone else was traveling with her. And while Maya was there, another war broke out in Lebanon. I mean, Israel invaded, all that was going on right before the Green Revolution there. And Maya was stuck in Lebanon. Her family was wealthy enough that they had a place up in the mountains so they could get out of Beirut where all the action was. But when Maya finally was able to come home, which was really quite a journey, it was covered, it was on the news here, it was in the paper, I think Channel 7 covered it, because it was quite a story that someone from Omaha would be stuck in a place like that. She came back and she told us the story at Bible study a couple of weeks later. And Maya was just bright. She was a physician, well-educated, and she just came back a broken woman. She was very tearful and had a hard time telling us about that story.
Why was she broken? What do you mean?
Well, this is what she came back to tell us is, why do they hate us so much? She was looking at it as, Israel hating
right.
The people in Lebanon. Why are they attacking us? Why do they hate us? And Lebanon is a really interesting place. It's not predominantly Muslim. It's not predominantly Christian. It's kind of a balanced place. And that whole civil war which was a 15-year war from 75 to 90, it was Muslim on Muslim, it was Christian on Christian, it was every faction against everybody else, everyone trying to gain an upper hand.
I got to spend some time in Israel, and we spent some time in the northern border there, right by Lebanon.
Exactly.
And I could look over the border. We were like in a lookout post. I could look over the border, and I saw a half-built casino. They were going to build this casino right on the other end of the border, and then, the wars broke out and everything, and it was this big old empty shell of a building. And it was very peaceful. Everybody in town where I was said they felt safe. At the same time, if I were to cross the border, they couldn't have guaranteed my safety. If I just would have walked across this line, there might have been somebody hiding in the bushes, and they said they couldn't have guaranteed my safety.
Exactly. Well, and it's still like that. In southern Lebanon, that is where Hezbollah is located. And, of course, Hezbollah stays, and it's almost a state within a state in Lebanon. In my reading, and I'm not an expert on this, but there's a tiny little piece of ground there called the Shabah Farms, which Israel still claims as part of their land, even though it's fully in Lebanon. And Hezbollah has said as long as there are these invaders in this land, meaning Israel, they will not leave. And so they use that sort of as a reason for staying, and they've grown. They have great power in Lebanon. They have great voice in the parliament, and that's where they are. And
so was your interest based in religion, or was your interest based in just current events, or what was the interest really based in?
A lot. Well, in that, those two things that stuck in my mind, Charlie being there and then hearing the story from Maya. And in 2010, I met a woman who works, it's a place called the Outreach Foundation, which is affiliated with my church, which is the Presbyterian Church. And she was telling us about the church in hard places. There's a Presbyterian church in Iran. There's a Presbyterian church in North Korea. There's a Presbyterian church in Cuba. And they've been there for, a long time based on the missionary movements from the late 19th century. And it just really piqued my mind. The people that were there it was a staff retreat, and we were hearing these stories. And they were saying kind of the same things that you hear all the time in this country about, they're all terrorists, Muslims hate Christians, all that kind of stuff. And in my mind, and I look at everybody this way, everyone is a human being first and foremost. Before they declare a faith, before they have a gender identity, before they're single, married, Russian, African, Asian, American, they're a human being. And so I tend to look at everybody like that. I even look at conservative Republicans as human beings first, okay? Which is true. And so Marilyn, her name was Marilyn Borst, and she
not all liberals feel that way, actually.
I know that. Yeah. Well, and being on the opposite end, I feel that as well. Bleeding heart, whatever you can call me, and I will claim it all. But first and foremost, we're all humans, and I think that's basic to my faith. Is we're all made in the image of God, right? I do believe that, and God said we were very good, and so I try to look at people as being very good, and I don't know why. We tend to look at each other as an enemy first instead of a human being. And so some things were said at Bible study that day, and I came down really hard on them. You can imagine I was devastated when we bombed Afghanistan. I was devastated when we invaded Iraq, all of those kinds of things. And when we start grouping people in these sort of with these big labels, and we don't know them, we don't look in their eyes and see them as human beings, it makes me mad. It makes me sad.
There's a comic had a bit that I love, and I've quoted it many times. He says, I've never understood anybody that hated somebody because of their religion, because of their skin color, because of their race, their ethnicity, because of their sexual orientation. Because once you get to know somebody on an individual, one-on-one basis, there are so many perfectly good reasons to hate them.
Well, there you go.
And it's
exactly. Okay. Well, that's another story for another day.
but it does prove a point, though. You're right. We find these things, and I spent 10 days in Israel, which nowhere near what you've spent over there. But having spent 10 days in Israel, I was surprised at how many different religions are in Israel itself.
Exactly.
And quite honestly, there are an awful lot of Muslims and Jews that get together and work together and, play together and that. But the leadership, and because of the terrorists and because of the politics and everything, they're fighting, and they don't understand why.
Well, and I can give you a great book to read about that called Tea with Hezbollah by Ted Decker and Carl Medeiros. And they go over and they visit all these places looking for the story of the Good Samaritan. And that's what they find is people are neighbors. They live together in the Jewish-Christian relations in the Middle East. They've lived together side by side for 1,400 years. That's their existence. They don't just cohabit the land. They are neighbors. They live together. So Marilyn gave me this great opportunity. She says, I have a trip I think you should go on. It's just women. We're going to the Middle East. We're going to Lebanon and Syria, and you should come. And so I went. And interestingly enough, and there was no war in Syria then. This was August of 2010. The war broke out in Syria about 7 months later in March. We went as a group of Presbyterian women to be with Presbyterian women in Lebanon and Syria, and we just had a blast of a time. The trip culminated in a women's conference up in the mountains above Beirut, and it was Lebanese, it was Syrian, it was Iraqi. There were lots of Iraqi refugees in Syria at the time being cared for by the church. Refugees from our war that we started, our war of choice, as people call it, and we got the chance to meet them as Americans in a land that wasn't their own, and hear their devastating stories of what had happened to them, everything they had lost. I mean, well-to-do families that had lost everything. And here they were living in these tiny little apartments. And to get beyond a refugee status, they had to register with the United Nations to be placed in another country far from home, very far from home. And there were, you look across the table from them, you share, if you've experienced that hospitality in the Middle East, you don't go anywhere, but they don't offer you coffee or tea or sweets. And it's just part of the ritual of life there. Whether they have $1 billion or whether they have $1, they will pour that hospitality out on you because that's who they are as Middle Easterners, whether they're Muslim, Christian, Jewish, whoever they are. And that's what we experienced there. But to be in the room with those Iraqi women, and we actually, when we were in Aleppo, Syria on that trip, we were invited into the homes of some of these refugees and were poured out with that hospitality, beautiful meals, and they would give us these little gifts to take home and remember. What
do they think about the Americans? When you're over there as an American, what do they think about you?
Well, they're very angry at our government. But as American citizens, that we were willing to come and sit there and talk with them, they were very respectful, and we left as friends. But we got a lot of harsh words directed to us.
Why are they angry at the government?
Because of the war.
And the invasion of Iraq.
Of Iraq. And it goes back even farther beyond the invasion. I mean, through all of the sanctions, probably the sanctions were the worst thing we did to them because it didn't hurt Saddam. It didn't hurt Saddam's sons. It didn't hurt the government. It hurt the people directly. And because he was such a strong-armed tyrant with a whole military at his disposal, they couldn't rise up against that. And when they did, you saw what happened, how he quashed the Kurds in the north. And even retreating from Kuwait, the waste that he laid to the land because we weren't willing to go in, and I don't believe we should have gone in. But we had supported that government when it was good for us, and then when it was not good for us, we turned on them, and the people are just devastated. And in the midst of all that, the minority populations of Christians specifically and Jews, there were still Jews in Iraq at the time, the Sunni were in power, but they were a minority group. Because they were a minority, they were kind of protected by Saddam. And then the backlash against all that came about when, the war, and we were helping, right? We were bringing down the tyrant, and what we were doing was unloosing a whole can of worms.
Well, yeah, we found that out afterwards, yeah.
Absolutely. So anyway, we met those families, and in particular, I met a really interesting character. His name was Edward Ashu. And he and his family were from the Baghdad area, and they had made their way to Syria. I met him in Damascus, and Edward was one of these really angry people. And we were on a really hot evening in August of 2010. It was about 115 degrees every day while we were there. We were staying in kind of a monastery in Damascus, and Edward came over, and we were all sharing drinks. The local beverage there is called arak, which is kind of an anise-flavored, really high-potent liquor, if I might say so. And we were drinking it straight over ice because it was hot. And we had a really interesting conversation. And he was angry. He was angry at the president. He was angry at George Bush. He was angry at Barack Obama. He was angry at the Senate. He was angry at McCain. Anyone you could have named. And I, this is Julie, peace activist, anti-war activist, trying to tell Edward that there were many people in our country who were opposed to all of that, not just from a faith-based perspective, but from the perspective that we're all humans and we don't have the right to take from you what's not ours, and certainly to destroy your country and destroy your home. Edward was not registered with the United Nations. He had no desire to go anywhere but home. And so I kept Edward in mind, specifically when I came back from that trip, thinking I never had the thought of going to Iraq, but had every desire to go back to Lebanon and Syria with these wonderful people we had met in the church and seeing what they were doing. The Presbyterian Church is a very small church in the Middle East. It's mostly, the ancient churches are there. The churches that were founded by the apostles. Jesus died, was resurrected, sent the 12 out, and those 12 were busy guys. And they founded churches everywhere. So, there's Greek Orthodox, there's Syrian Orthodox, there's Armenian Orthodox, Melkite Catholic, just every kind of Orthodox and Catholic church that from the beginning, the faith that came to us came from them. And so certainly my curiosity was piqued about finding out more about the history of my faith and to walk with those people. And some of the interesting people we met on that trip, who are with me even today, a Syrian archbishop that we met in Aleppo, named Johanna Ibrahim. And it's been a year this month. He was kidnapped in Aleppo, and they haven't heard anything from him. No ransom demand. They have no idea who took him. And they took another archbishop with him at the same time. And that was a man I met in his office with him. Shared coffee, shared tea, shared sweets on a hot day in August in Aleppo, Syria, which is one of the oldest cities in the world, and the depth of historical artifacts and historical places that are there that are being completely wiped out because of this war. And so I take him to bed with me every night in my prayers. Let him go, let him go. Those kinds of things, I knew I wanted to go back. I didn't know anything about what would happen to him later, but meeting him and seeing, this is one of my favorite stories from that trip. We were traveling with this wonderful young Presbyterian pastor named Ibrahim and Sierra, who's still in Aleppo, will not leave. His church is there. It's been destroyed, but they still meet in homes. And he's there, and he's a very, very activist pastor. And to see him, all right, this is going to be the sort of church part that might be weird. This Reformed church pastor having a conversation with his counterpart, this Syrian Orthodox priest, whose name was also Ibrahim, interestingly enough. And I looked at him and I thought, this is a weird picture for someone who grew up in the Catholic Church, understands the ancient history of the church, who's now in the Reformed Church with a bunch of people who really don't get where their faith came from, talking about the nuances of why they're different.
Yeah, it's
weird.
It is weird, and we do find a lot more reason. We're a lot more alike than we want to admit, and we try to find these reasons to divide each other, and that's really
exactly.
I mean, I remember a couple of things when I was in Israel. I was at the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. And have you ever been to Israel?
No.
Church of the Holy Sepulchre. It's a beautiful place. It's where they say Jesus was crucified, and you go to the shrine, and you have where the Roman Catholics say it happened, and like 3 feet to the left are where the Greek Orthodox say where it happened. And they argue about this sort of stuff. Do the Stations of the Cross. I'm sorry, it's a Wednesday. You can't do it. It's our turn, that sort of stuff. And you just wonder why are you fighting over this sort of stuff? I mean, it's frustrating. I remember having a conversation at breakfast with a Jewish friend. And, I was raised Catholic too, and having a discussion, and we were talking about the birth control, the Catholic Church's birth control. And he was starting to tell me, how stupid he thought the church's position on birth control was. And I looked at him and I said, with all due respect, you're a man who won't put cheese on your hamburger because of religion, I mean, if that's what your belief is, great. But why would you criticize somebody else's belief if it was a little bit different,
Exactly. And I think it actually In my opinion, it's all a language issue. We don't have words to describe the indescribable, so we come up with our own, and then we fight over it. And I get in trouble at church all the time for saying stuff like that. But it was an amazing thing, and those people are still there. They're still there, living there. Some of them just will not leave. It's their home. Why should they leave?
Did you find, as you've been to all these different countries, Syria, Lebanon, Iraq, you've been to all these different countries, have you found that maybe they are a lot more alike than they want to admit to? In other words, or the real differences between the different countries? Let's face it. There are differences between, let's say us and somebody from even Mexico, because of culturally and everything like that. But that area there, A, it's a lot more compact. They're a lot closer together. And B, a lot more of a shared history. So were they a lot more alike than different from the various countries?
They're not. I think they're very different, and I think that's part of the what we don't get in this country. We have American history. We do a little overview of world history when we're in high school, and unless you go on and study it farther, there were great empires that occupied that place: the Medes, the Persians, the Ottomans. I mean, all of those people had different cultures, those people groups, and then someone came in and took them over. And so when you're in Iraq, you are an Iraqi. And this was interesting at the church in Iraq in Basra, where I was just visiting. They have a gatekeeper who lets you in and lets you out. That's really the only security they have. No arms or anything. And he's of African heritage, and we found that interesting. Is he an African Iraqi? And pastors told us, no, he's not an African. He's an Iraqi. He will tell you he's an Iraqi. His ancestors were brought there in the time of slave trading. So that's something they experienced too. But to him, he's not an African Iraqi. He's an Iraqi. And they hold that really close to themselves. In Lebanon, it's very important to say you are a Phoenician. That's the culture that gave birth to that land. And so they proudly say they're Phoenicians, or they're and that whole part of the world was Syria. So what is Lebanon? What is Israel? What is Syria? What is part of Iraq? And all that whole area was called Syria. So there is this sort of lengthy attachment that they have to where they are, and they are very proudly they will tell you that their roots go in. They can take you back 2,000 or 3,000 years. That's how long their family's been there. So they're very proudly that, which is interesting, and they're very different from country to country. This is my favorite thing about that. The first time I got there, the greeting is the kiss on the cheek. And so we met people in Lebanon, and it was kiss, 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 3 kisses. We got to Syria, it was kiss, kiss. It was two kisses. And then when we were with the Iraqi families, it was 4 kisses. And so that's how I started tracking where they were from, was how many kisses you got on the cheek.
But that's sort of my point, is that they actually are very much alike. It's just that it's like maybe 2 brothers that are too much alike, so they can't get along, that sort of a thing.
They all probably came. Yeah. If you go back in the biblical tree, they're all Semites. They all came from the branch of Shem, which was, I think, one of Noah's sons. I'm not that literate on that, but that's interesting. They all come from the same thing, but they've spread out. They've been conquered. They've been subjected to somebody else's law. And now those borders mean something to them. And of course, those borders were set by colonial powers, which is interesting. So they fight over the land. And of course, the split between Sunni and Shia, which is that is overlaid over that whole area, which goes back early in the history of Islam, very early in the history of Islam, that schism happened. And then put on that, the creation of the state of Israel. Palestinians are real people, and they've lived there for centuries. And we have people in this country who claim there's never been anything that it was called Palestine, but there was. Mm-hmm. So yeah, that's part of the problem, I think.
What I found interesting when I was over in Israel is just that there's so much history. People are, and they all think that God wants them to be there. Now I know that's at least with Israel. Is it the same way in Syria? Let me tell my story, and then I'll ask about Syria and that. Because When I was in Israel, I spent some time, we traveled all over the country, and I spent some time on one of the settlements. And I'm talking to the woman that was in charge of this settlement there in the West Bank. And I asked her, I said...
So it was a Jewish settlement in the West Bank.
Jewish settlement in the West Bank. And I asked her, I said, look, I said, I was raised Catholic, I said, but I pay my taxes, I mow my lawn, could I live here? And she got very angry at me. It was like, you just tell her voice, no, you can't live here. God wants us to be here, not you. God wants us to be here. And it was like, okay, there was like no way to rationalize with that, So like in these other countries, whether it be Syria or Lebanon, whatever, is there that same, whether it be the Muslims or the Jews or the Christians or whatever, is there still that sort of religious war going on in those countries too? Or is that something that is more of a Israeli-Palestinian thing?
It doesn't go on like that. And that, I think, is the heartbreak from making these trips, is coming back, having heard from a number of people. Again, like I said, the Archbishop, Melkite Catholic Archbishop of Baalbek. Baalbek is another very historic place in northern Lebanon, just up in the Bekaa Valley. Christians have been there since the first century. I mean, his church celebrated their 1900th anniversary. Can you imagine that? And he was one of the speakers at the conference we were at in January, talking about, he was one of those who's very strong voices. He was part of a panel with a Sunni Muslim professor, wanting us to know, we are neighbors. We have lived here together for 1,400 years. We don't fight. We get along. We go to each other's services. Our kids are friends with each other. What's being imposed on them now is this very fundamentalist political Islam. It's a very small minority of people. That's what causes the problem. They've been coexisting there, living there, sharing the land, sharing the towns, sharing life together for all these years with no problem. That is not what's happening. That is not what's happening. And I hear it from the pastors. We heard it from the Muslim clerics who talk to us. It just blows my mind. And they all with one voice really say it's this very small minority, very tiny minority, but they're loud and they have weapons and they're funded by people who have other agendas. They would tell you that right now what they think is happening in Syria is a proxy war between the Sunnis in Saudi Arabia and the Shiite in Iran. And this is the new battleground, is Syria, and they're breaking it apart. And it's why we really don't want to be involved.
And then you got Russia and the United States
exactly.
all playing a game here. Yeah.
So there you go again. Whose side do you take? And we've taken all those sides. We took the side of those same people in Afghanistan when it behooved us to support them against the Russians, right? That's Al-Qaeda.
Yeah.
That's Al-Qaeda, who we were then fighting against for how many years have we been in Afghanistan? We're still in Afghanistan 12 years later. Al-Qaeda was who we probably would have been supporting in Syria if we had sent arms or if we had bombed them like everybody wanted to do last fall. I mean, that's seriously the people who bombed the World Trade Center, we would have been helping them. And that is the weirdness.
The enemy of my enemy is my friend.
Exactly. And we've got to learn how to stay out of it. They would ask us to a person to stay out of it. The president.
Do they think that, okay, because we, and this is all some big dysfunctional thing, but we think we can solve the problems. I mean, I'm an American, and I really, all I knew about what was happening in the Middle East is what I read in the paper and what I saw on TV and all that. But I was convinced that if I got over there and spent 10 days there and just talked to people, I'd be able to find a solution. I was so sure I'd be able to find a solution. And my solution was, I'm out of here, because it's so convoluted and so messed up. There really is no real solution, is there? I mean,
I would say here I am. Only God knows. I don't know what it is, but it takes it doesn't take ratcheting up voices. It takes quieting down. And to me, I mean, they have this great history of hospitality to each other. That if they could find a common ground to sit down and figure it out, but the voice of political Islam, I think, is what they all fear. And I think that's why you saw what happened in Egypt happen. We supported a coup in Egypt to oust the elected president of Egypt, Mr. Morsi. But his voice became more fundamentalist the longer he led, right? He's the Muslim Brotherhood. That's part of this fanatic group and so we helped. Here we are, the United States of America helped oust the democratically elected president of Egypt. The weirdness of it all gets to me sometimes. I try not to go into the politics too much because I'm not an expert and I don't have the answer. What I've discovered on those trips is the same people that people told me to be afraid of my whole life, that are very genuine. And what I've discovered is they want the same things for themselves and their families that we want. And when we decide that our lives are more important, so we have to be safe, that we destroy their lives and their livelihood, that is not a good thing. And that's what I've seen a lot of what we've done, especially in Iraq.
Again, going back to my experience in Israel, which I thought was fascinating in that I was talking to a Muslim who was working with the Jews and trying to find solutions to, stop the wars and stop the violence and the bombings and all of that. And this woman said to me, she said, if there's a suicide bomber that, blows up a coffee shop, the mother will be on TV yelling, all praise to Allah, all praise to Allah. And then when the TV cameras are off, she cries the tears of a mother that has lost her son. And you realize, again, just how stupid this whole thing is. There's no reason for this sort of thing. And it does just seem to escalate in that. So now we've established what some of the problem is and some of the background. Now you're going over there as it's a Presbyterian woman. I sort of joked about how I thought I could solve the problem in Israel. What are a bunch of Presbyterian women from Omaha, Nebraska doing to help, solve this?
I was the only one from Omaha. No one else. I've never been able to convince anybody from my church to go with me, other than my husband went with me in January to Lebanon and Syria, and he went to Iraq with me in November of 2012. So I've gotten Steve to go with me. But first I had to make sure it was safe. That's a joke. Please don't put that in there. There's nothing we can do except the sole function of our going is to be with the church. And that's the weird thing that most people I don't think can understand. But all of Paul's letters in the New Testament, he talks about, I long to be with you. We pray for you. We be with you. And so our whole function is to go really and be a living letter to the church.
And isn't that part of the problem? I think about if we had, let's say, Muslims coming over here from, Iraq or Syria trying to, convert our people, that'd be a problem.
That's why I'd like to correct you. I'm the worst evangelist that has ever walked the planet, because I'm not someone who's interested in converting anybody, and that is one of the things I think Christians in the United States and in the West go to those places thinking they're going to do. It's totally against the law for someone in Lebanon or Iraq or Iran or Afghanistan or any of those places to switch from one faith to another, unless they're becoming a Muslim. Of course, you can do that, but you cannot. It's a death penalty offense in many cases to claim that you are a Christian when you were born a Muslim. What it says on your ID card is who you are. It's not what you profess, and you can't switch. And that's never been our intention going there. And there are many Christians who used the war, for instance, to go over secretly. I'm going to go over and help build water projects. I'm going to go over and teach English. And all the time in the back of their mind, they're going, I'm going to bring the good news to a bunch of Muslims who need to know who Jesus is. That's not why we go. We go to be with the church, the indigenous church of those places, which is not operating in secret. It's been there, like I said, from the beginning.
And they're left alone.
They are mostly left alone. They get in the crossfire. There are times today. Let me tell you, today I come today with my heart broken. I didn't. There was news today that this lovely man. I've never met him. I'll never get to meet him now. A Jesuit priest who's been living in Syria for most of the last 50 years, learned how to speak Arabic, came to Syria, and started I think he was trained as a psychologist. So he was working with disabled people. He lived in the Jesuit monastery in Homs, Syria, which has been in the news a lot lately. Homs used to have a Christian population of about 60,000 people, and it's been one of the really hot places in this war, a siege there for the last 2 years. and the Christians were just driven out. And this was mostly by extremists. And of course, there's so much action in that part of Syria that all the different factions are there. The government's fighting the rebels are fighting the government, and this little group of Christians that remained, which was less than 100, the last I heard, wasn't going anywhere because it's their home. I mean, it's their home. And Father Vanderlucht was there caring for them in the monastery if they could get there, caring for Muslims who are also caught. I mean, 150,000 people have been killed there, most of them Muslim, many of them Christian. And here's Father Vanderlucht today was pulled out of his house and shot in the head twice, dead, 75 years old. And it just breaks my heart. Targeted, who knows why. My friend, one of my pastor friends in Syria, I asked him what happened. He said it was insurgents, fundamentalist insurgents. News reports indicated, well, it could have been government activists. It could have just been anti-government activists. But he was being protected by people there, whoever they were for, because he was caring for people without regard to what God they professed. And he was helping feed people, care for them, and they refused to leave. He refused to leave.
Well, while we use terms here in the media and just politicians use it, Muslim fundamentalists and the Shias and the Sunnis or whatever, would a way for us to understand it here in America be almost like, and I don't mean any offense to any religion here, but like gangs? In other words, you got the Crips and the Bloods, and they fight, and people, in certain neighborhoods, they fight over, if you're from a different gang, you shouldn't be in this neighborhood, sort of a thing, because this is our turf. Is it a similar, and maybe because religion and thousands of years of history are behind it, it's different, but is it a similar mindset, do you think?
I don't know. Yeah, that's a terrible answer. That's a really hard question. One of the people we heard from in January was a Muslim scholar I think he was from one of the large universities in Beirut, either American University of Beirut or Lebanese American University. Very well known and well-respected institutions, trying to give us a very brief history of what he called political Islam. This man was a Muslim, a Sunni Muslim, what we would call a moderate Muslim, which is the majority of them. Just like the majority of Christians are moderates, kind of lukewarm in their faith, really not really activist, right? Political Islam is something very different, and it's been developing over about probably back to 1930s or 1940s. And it's not even, his words would tell me it's not even religious. It's about the letter of the law. And I would say, this is what I try to say, my friends in the church back here, is you wouldn't let Westboro Baptist Church speak for you as a Christian, or the Ku Klux Klan, or the Christian Identity Movement. And that's kind of how they're getting painted by these groups, these kind of really fundamentalist, hardline groups that have really misconstrued what the word in the Quran would tell them. And so it's not even a matter of gangs, it's a matter of political fundamentalism. It's, pardon me, sometimes it can be a little bit like the Tea Party.
Why?
I don't mean to cast aspersions about that, but you
did though.
I'm sorry.
That's part of the thing. I mean, as a liberal talking about loving everybody. You even made a comment earlier about I even love conservatives and stuff like that.
My dad was a conservative.
What about I'm just saying? But sounds like that. Not sounds, but I mean, in other words, are you talking out of both sides of your mouth?
I'm trying not to. I'm trying to use a metaphor, an analogy.
Now, granted, there's no weapons involved here, and nothing. We're just having a spirited debate. But is that to some ways, in a verbal way, much different than what they're doing in a more violent way over in these countries?
And I see it creeping here in that way. I don't want any more of the, I get in trouble with a good friend of mine at church. We've agreed to disagree on most issues, but it's the difference between, I'll try to use what I know. I think Rachel Maddow is a pretty well-respected and well-read. She does her research. She's a very different kind of a voice for the liberal movement than, say, thinking, what's his name? Oh my gosh, Ed Schultz.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And so Ed Schultz's words can paint liberals in a bad light. Just like I think, I'm trying to think of some of the Tea Party people who have, who've been so vocal. There's a woman who just would not give up on President Obama's lack of a birth certificate. I can't think of her name. But those people.
The congresswoman from Minnesota?
No, not even Michelle Bach. She wasn't even an elected official.
Malkin? Michelle Malkin?
No. And it'll, I would have to, have to Google it. Anyway, but those kind of voices make the entire Tea Party, don't you think, look sometimes a little ridiculous.
I do.
And if that's what you believe, but you wouldn't want that person to be your spokesperson, right? I don't want Ed Schultz to be who speaks for me. You
know who speaks for me? Me.
There you go.
Okay. And that's it. And just because I may disagree with you politically doesn't mean that I think you're a bad person.
Right.
But I think sometimes, and politicians do it, the media does it, and just in general, I think sometimes because somebody has a different view than you, we automatically assume that they're bad people. I love talking about going to a football stadium. And you go to a football stadium, and I don't know who there is, Republican, Democrat, Catholic, atheist, Jew, Muslim. I don't know any of that stuff. Because they're all there wearing the team colors, rooting for the home team, or even if they're from the opposing team, you don't go punch, maybe a little good-natured ribbing, and you don't punch them out. You can have different points of view without having to think of the other person as the enemy, right?
Right, absolutely.
I mean, are we not all Americans first? And I think sometimes that we look at ourselves more like, well, I'm a liberal, so I'm special, or I'm a conservative, so I'm special, as opposed to looking at like, we're all Americans here. Let's try to find the common ground and work towards better solutions.
Yeah. And I don't want to get in trouble with anybody on your podcast. I try not to even look at myself as an American first. I try to really seriously look at myself as a human being. And a great quote from a book I read when I was the mission coordinator at church as a Christian, that first and foremost, I'm a citizen of the kingdom. I'm a resident of the empire. So I try to put that above everything. I do. I'm lucky to be in a country like this where I can use this microphone to say my opinion. I'm not put down for the way I vote, for the way I dress, that I'm a woman, I can drive a car, that, I can control bank accounts. I have all of that. I'm very lucky. And and when I hear people say, by the grace of God, that's who I am and what I have. I have a hard time going with that because I think God's grace is available for everybody wherever they are. And because I have money, because I live in a nice house, because I live in the United States, doesn't mean I have an extra measure of grace from God. So what I want to go back to about political Islam is they have hijacked that from the majority of the people who follow that book, who follow that way. And the vast majority of Muslims are painted with a broad brush by what those people do. And that is, so I don't look at it as gangs. There are certainly gangs of people who are following one leader or another. And here's the interesting thing is, they'll look at each other and say, you don't have it right. If you don't believe my way, you're out of here. And so a lot of the violence is being committed one group against another, not Sunni Shia, not Muslim Christian. It's fundamentalist versus fundamentalist because you don't read it the way I do. You don't get it. You're wrong. And there's no middle ground for them. And that's where Christians are in trouble, is when they're in the middle of that. And they are, when some of those groups take control of an area, they are trying to drive out those who don't believe like them. And many Christians have suffered horribly in that.
How big are these groups? In other words, are they just small groups with with bombs and weapons? So you notice them a lot more. Is it the guy that speaks the loudest gets noticed, although they're the minority? Is that the sort of a thing going on up there?
I couldn't even give you a number on that. When we were there, we were being told that there are hundreds of these groups now. There are literally hundreds. You've heard of like the Al-Nusra Front or the ISIS, what the acronym stands for, is Al-Qaeda in Iraq and Syria, and they're trying to. Those are some of the bigger ones, but there's, I guess, a lot of smaller ones. And if you go on any of those websites, even every once in a while in the New York Times, you can find lots of videos uploaded from places like that, on Al Jazeera, Al Arabiya. You can follow those things, and there are a lot of the numbers may not be great. I mean, Syria has a pretty big army, and President Assad is gaining back control in a lot of those places, but the arms come in, and it's funded by kidnapping people, like probably those archbishops, except no one's asked for a reward for him. Many of the people in the churches in Iraq, in Syria, have had family members kidnapped for ransom, and when they pay the ransom, those monies are going to buy weapons and arms to drive out people, and there doesn't seem to be any end of those kind of resources pouring into that place in all different ways.
What I always thought whenever I traveled overseas, especially to a place like Israel, I always thought it was interesting in that if somebody were to just know the United States from what they saw on TV or what they read in the paper, or know Omaha, for what they saw on TV or read in the paper, they would have such a slanted idea of what that area was.
Baywatch.
Yeah.
Baywatch.
Right, yeah.
That's how they know.
When you said you're from America, that was Baywatch, huh?
Baywatch.
Yeah.
We met a number of young people who had learned English from watching American television. I'm like, oh my gosh, what a horror, what a nightmare. And so when we go as American Christians, brothers and sisters in the church, to be with them and to hear their stories and just sit with them. And by the fact that we show up, means a lot to them. And when we leave, it's like, that little church in Basra, it's 45 people, most of them all related to each other, almost all of whom I know by name, and almost all of whom I'm friends with on Facebook. It's like my second church home. If I wasn't belonging to my church here in Omaha, if I was going to be anywhere in the world, I would be with them in that church for what they do, how they care for their neighborhood. And their neighborhood is almost entirely Muslim. They have a kindergarten of 200 kids. 198 of them are Muslim. And they cannot teach them about Jesus, but they teach them how to be nice to each other, how to love each other, how to love their neighbor. And those kids take it home. Their parents see a change in them. And they say, why can't you have a grade 1, grade 2, grade 3? This is what we want our kids to learn. And that's the effect they're having on their neighborhood. And are they in serious trouble? They could be. Last July, they're right across the street from a hotel. We stay in that hotel when we're in Basra. Walk across the street every day to the church. And last July, car bombs went off on either side of the hotel, not because they were after the church, but because it's a place in the Sunni South where oil magnates meet at the hotel. And so, the Shiite South, and the Sunnis were attacking the hotel, trying to kill people in the hotel. So they blew up a bomb on one side, hoping people would rush out the other side where the next bomb waited. And that was right in front of the church building. It blew out all the windows in the church. Brand new pastor, he'd been there just a few months from Egypt, came out after he heard the first explosion to see what was going on and saw the car blow up in the air. And, fortunately they have a blast wall in front of the church or he would have been toast. But that's kind of what they live in. But what do? They get up the next day, they repair the windows, they open up the preschool, they have church on Sunday. The elder there is a reconstructive surgeon who works in the hospital, taking care of people who have been injured by bomb blasts. And that's their life in that part of the world. And they've been living it for generations.
One of the podcasts we have on the page here is from a soldier who spent time in Iraq and now dealing with post-traumatic stress disorder. After 3 tours over there, he has post-traumatic stress disorder. And he said something in the podcast that really struck me. He says, only in America is post-traumatic stress a disorder. He says, if you live over there, that's just a way of life. I mean, the idea that, that there could be a bomb at any time, the idea that, there might be some violence or you could be kidnapped or anything like that. We don't think about it here in America. Over there, it's a reality. And so they're always living with what we call a disorder. For them, it's post-traumatic stress day of life.
It is life. And they do live like that. I mean, the first time we were in Basra, is that every time I've gone, I take it with a grain of salt. Everyone says, duck, be sure to duck. Are you afraid to go? Are you afraid you're going to get blown up? Are you afraid you're going to get kidnapped? Well, no. I mean, you don't you don't go in fear. If fear is in front of you, you're not going to go. And what Marilyn always tells us is, if you're waiting for things to be safe in the Middle East, you will never go. You'll never go. So we go. First time we were in Basra. That was November of 2011. And we were in that same hotel the last night of our trip, which was a fabulous trip. And we blogged it every day. I started writing poetry about all these trips that was the only way I could journal my experience. And so I'm writing the entry that night, and the rest of them are playing cards by the window in the hotel, which overlooks the church. And all of a sudden, can you imagine? This was that we were leaving on the plane the next morning. Gunfire erupted outside of our hotel room, and it went on a long, long time. And there were 4 pastors in our group, and then 4 others of us. And Mark, I just love this guy. He's from Huntsville, Alabama. One of my best friends now. And he says, I think we should move away from the windows. And I'm over there just typing away, listening. I go, wow, interesting that would happen on our last night in Basra, Iraq. Happened to be while the American drawdown was going on. We actually saw columns of American troops heading back to the south to Kuwait to leave the country. And so 2011, I meant to say. So, we're all like, what's going on? So someone goes down and checks with the hotel desk. What else do you do when you're staying in a hotel and gunfire erupts? It turned out that the Iraqi soccer team had just defeated the Jordanian soccer team, and they were out celebrating. That's how they celebrated. It went on for about an hour. Gunfire, just shot after shot after shot. It sounded like a war. But for them, it was just normal life, and we were not in any danger.
And if a bullet drops and kills somebody, hey, it happens.
Exactly. And it was at this hotel, there were a lot of wedding receptions that happened. So, we were used to there being activity there all the time. But that was a really interesting thing. And Mark came back and he preached a great sermon about Iraq without a flak jacket. And that's how he went. The people in that church have no armed protection. In October of 2010 in Baghdad, there was... I want to get my denominations right, a Syrian Orthodox church that was holding services. And they were invaded by a group of fundamentalist insurgents and who just shot the place up. And the priest came and said, I'm the one you want, take me. And of course they killed him outright as well. But 50, 60 people were killed that day in services before the government reacted and stepped in to stop it. And so that was happening in Basra, down in Basra in the south, when that was going on. When word of that came down to them, the Muslim neighbors of that little Presbyterian church gathered around that church to protect them. Because they said, not in our neighborhood will this happen. We will watch out for you. And that's the way they live. And that's been our experience when we were there.
What is the one thing, maybe two, but what that we here in America that just see the news and just see it on TV, if we're even paying attention, and I'd like to pay attention to what's happening over there, but Dancing with the Stars is on or whatever, But what is the one thing people that are paying attention to the news and just see it from a media perspective that's going on over there the story that we're just not getting?
Yeah, and we had this great opportunity to meet with President Assad when we were in Damascus in January, which was totally unexpected. And I took that opportunity. What would you tell me to tell the people back in America as we watch this on the news, as they make judgments about you and your country and what's going on here and what we think you should do to fix the problem, like get rid of you. You're an eye doctor. What's your prescription for American eyes? He said, take the long view. We are so short-sighted here about everything, read more, learn more. There are vast resources. I'm not that educated on the subject, but I can find books to read on the history of Lebanon, the history of Syria, the history of Iraq. Why is it like it is there? It's not from what's happened in the last 10 years, the last 30 years, the last 50 years. It's what's happened in the last 2 millennia. And that's a long view backwards that you take to get a long view forwards. And, just great books, great authors. There are lots of learned people out there. Golly, find some people from those places. Here in Omaha, we're kind of a crossroads of places. We have people from all over here. They're your neighbors. We have an Arabic-speaking fellowship at our church now. People from the Sudan, people from Egypt, people from Lebanon. They live here, and you can use them as resources and talk to them. I say get to know real people. That's why I make people laugh at me for as much time as I spend on Facebook, but probably half my friends on Facebook, which is one of the few good ways I can communicate with people in real time, are in Lebanon. They're in Iraq. They're in Syria. They're in Europe. There are places outside of this little bubble we live in, which it's a big, expansive country, but we have our own walls up here, and we try not to cross over them. We don't want our lives affected by what's going on somewhere else. Well, my life has been affected by that, and I can't go back. You can't go back. I can't just be Julie in Omaha, Nebraska, thinking about what 8 teams are coming to the College World Series in June. We laugh about all the people running for governor, and that's an important thing. It's an important thing to elect a good, strong leader for our state that's going to take us forward. But my heart, most of the time these days, is spent 7,000 miles to the east, where the sun comes up 9 hours earlier. And I don't ever want that to change. I want that to be what's on my headstone when I die, whether it's over there or over here. And I wish other people would, again, I go back to the beginning, to see people as human beings first. And they all have a story. They all have a name. Every one of their lives is as valuable as yours or mine.
I want to thank Julia Prescott Burgess for joining us today and telling the story of her experience, of her beliefs, of what she's trying to accomplish. A very nice woman who has had the opportunity to meet with the many of the people there in Lebanon, many people in Syria, and give a different perspective that maybe you wouldn't get in the news. Hey, join us every week here. Every Sunday, we have a new interesting person to talk to. It's a big community of people, and if you have somebody that you think I ought to interview, or maybe a type of person you'd like me to hear from, and something like that, well, don't be afraid. Send me an email, send me a note, and say, Tom, why don't you do something like this? This is all of our project, not just mine. So I want to thank you once again for joining us here at TomBecka.com. If you liked it, would you please tell your friends? Would you spread the word? Would you share this on your social media? If you could, make a little goodwill donation, help out a little bit. You can just go on TomBecka.com. Boom, there's a link right there. You can make an easy donation to help keep this thing afloat. Till next time, thanks for listening. Take care.